So this is going to be an interesting contrast, connection between these two artists. Jennifer Packer, the show, her show is opening at the Whitney on the 30th. And she is, she's a 37-year-old artist, so fairly young. Just as you see that picture up at the top, she just is coming off of having won the American Academy Rome Prize, which in the art world is known as a very prestigious thing to do. I mean, basically, it really says a lot about an artist if they win that prize and actually get that residency. So she's just back from that, and she goes straight from that into the Whitney. Contrasting that with Beauford Delaney, who basically died in 1979, as you see with the dates down below. He was a prominent member of the Harlem Renaissance. He actually, in actuality, he in 1930 won a residency at the Whitney. At that time, they did residencies at the Whitney Museum. They had a studio and apartment, and he worked as a custodian, but was given a studio and apartment in the building. In 1930, that was not shabby because, we were in the middle of the Depression. So that's quite a wonderful thing to have. I'll talk much more about his life and all that. I'm going to work her over first. Let's see. Oh, if you guys have any questions, put them in the chat, and I'll try to get around to looking at them. I can't promise that because once I get into talking, I kind of forget to look down there. But we'll see how that goes. All right, so I'm moving along here. Okay, so this is a painting by Jennifer Packer. Eric is the subject sitting in a room of things, almost like satellites floating around him. This portrait of fellow artist and friend Eric Knack is one of many paintings she's done of him in what seems to be an ongoing dialogue. There's actually a YouTube of them with a young art historian, and them talking about, he's an artist, she's an artist. They kind of talk to each other and are fed questions by the art historian. It's worth looking at. It was a stretch. They're both very intelligent, very articulate people, and basically it was a stretch for me to keep up with them. It's definitely worth watching. They were both Yale graduates. So anyway, let me talk a little bit about this painting. Very washy oil paint, relatively small, 19 by 17, kind of monochromatic with that yellow ochre and scratched into, so it's like wet into wet. It was very, there's a level of spontaneity that's there, but really beautifully crafted, good drawing, and good draftsman, very interesting, quality. the white spaces, the openness of the composition is something that you'll see in her work. Basically, she's kind of working it with a rag and then working back into it with paint, but very thin, very, you know, subtle, sensitive observation. You know, those scratches into it to redraw the thing into the washes of paint are very, you know, really very sensitive and interesting. Notice that he's got one red sock on and one yellow. Anyway, so she's really interested in capturing the personality of her sitters in a very in one shot. She's really not somebody who's going to labor these pieces. But by the same token, she's very skilled. I mean, looking at this piece, these pieces, again, wet into wet, really thin paint, scratching into it to articulate the drawing. Very few objects, but those objects kind of situate the sitter in a room with very little, you know, very little articulation, but, you know, what's there gets the point across. Okay, and she's really in a dialogue with art history. You know, there's the abstract expressionists, there's the very loose figurative work, Woman with a Newspaper, this Richard Diebenkorn. He very much was influenced by somebody like de Kooning, but came back to figuration, very simplified. And on the right, we have a Vuillard. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring Vuillard into this is the subtle color, but also the sense of atmosphere, and that's a commonality to something that's in Jennifer's work. Okay. Abigail. Now, you know, there's this use of pattern and using that to kind of articulate the form and to bring it through. Really beautiful quality, using that same kind of violet in the wall behind her, and in the blouse and in the pants, and having that kind of white frock kind of separating her from that background, but having it be the same color. So there's a tension that's going on there between the flatness and the depth. The drawing is what really pulls her out into our presence. You know, big, generous shapes, beautiful, substantial Black woman. You know, one of the things that I really want to draw your attention to is, again, this Black identity, this business of in the lily white art world, having a Black portrait is something which is relatively new. I mean, really, over the past maybe 40 or 50 years, there's been inroads made, but it's really the focus over since the 80s, where a lot of Black artists have been addressing this more full on. And notice the patterns, notice the use of patterning and this very thin washy paint. I'm going to move on to Matisse, who is somebody that she looked long and hard at. And again, you look at this light, brushy quality, the thin veils of paint, the shape relationships, the use of patterning as a way to define the space and to create an atmosphere for the figure to occupy. And on the left, I put in this Giorgio Morandi piece to talk a little bit more about those white spaces. And really the use of white as a, just these broad spaces to allow there to be breath in the piece, to allow it to be open. It's kind of like in the silence between notes in music, allowing the paint to speak. And if you look at this, this lovely little watercolor by Morandi, you can see how that granular quality of the paint is really beautiful. But the shapes around the things, the white shapes that are around the objects, are as interesting as the objects themselves. And I know that Jennifer Packer has looked at Morandi and absorbed this, and you can see it in her work. Okay, but the other issue here is presence. The body has memory. Combining observation, improvisation, and memory, Packer paints intimate portraits of friends and family members, people she loves, often captured at home or in their own space. Her sitters appear casual and relaxed in their surroundings. In my work, I really want to make sure that images are tied to a specific person or authentic identity. That's not just anyone or superficial. So, I mean, in looking at the Matisse, she's really kind of a non-specified person. It's present, it's beautifully drawn, beautifully painted, but who is she? Is there any of her personality in this? And when you look at this, you see, there's a mood to this piece. There's a real, I also, the thing that I also love about her work is her really, minimal palette. She keeps it really, simple, monochromatic, very few colors, but does a lot with those few colors. And the paint application is just terrific. Okay. Let me not. So the abstracted form in this composition is really interesting. The close color range, this green dominant, but what's going on back there? We don't know. They're kind of very loose geometric forms. Now this harkens to the abstract expressionists, to the color field painters. There's an echo in this of a number of abstract painters. And I'm gonna again, but the personality of the sitter and that presence, look at what's not painted. And look at how those spaces operate in this painting. Really interesting. Very well done. And I'm going to go back to Richard Diebenkorn. Close color, veils of paint. There's the brushwork and the articulation, you know. Okay. So this is a charcoal. It's an early piece. Actually, she was still at Yale at that point. She graduated from Yale with her MFA in 2000. Oh, I didn't do any background stuff. Let me do a little of that too. She was born in Philadelphia. Went to Tyler as an undergraduate and got into the MFA program at Yale. Graduated from there in 2012 and won a residency at the studio school in Harlem, studio museum in Harlem, which is very prestigious. And a number of the people that I've talked about, people of color who I've talked about in my talks, have won that prize and that residency. It makes a very big difference to people's lives. So this is a really interesting piece. Through gestures, both subtle and forthright, Packer's work carries a political resonance. You know, looking at this image, you know, yeah, it's swimming at a swimming hole. There's a swing on a rope and all that stuff. But, you know, given, you know, this half submerged body, you know, the rope, there's implications of this that are a little bit more ominous than just a summer swim. My inclination to paint, especially from life, is a completely political one. We belong here. We deserve to be seen and acknowledged as in real time. We deserve to be heard, to be imaged with shameless generosity and accuracy. Very interesting. So she is really a member of a fairly large group of young Black artists who are very stridently putting forward a, you know, image of Black people in this world. Okay, and here's a group, a very small group in comparison to how many people are out there who are actually pursuing this. I did a talk on Jordan Castile. She actually just completed a fairly substantial mural off of the High Line. Kerry James Marshall, if you are not familiar with his work, check him out on YouTube. The man is brilliant, absolutely amazing, articulate, and terrifying at times, but actually really wonderful, funny, very clear about what he's doing and what his mission is. And then the Obamas, which I think everyone knows at this point. So these are just some of the context that Jennifer is working in. These are some contemporary artists. Okay. And I mentioned that there was a correlation between Beauford and Jennifer, and this is really the fire next time. Beauford was involved with Baldwin, with James Baldwin. And if any of you know The Fire Next Time, it is an essay that Baldwin wrote back in the 60s, which is an indictment of the white racial issues that were so dominant in the 50s and 60s. But if you read or listen to this essay now, unfortunately, it is just as relevant. It has so much to say to us now, and well worth pursuing and looking for. Anyway, The Fire Next Time was the name of that just amazing essay that he wrote. The interesting part about this piece is it's very abstract, and yet there's a number of things that I forgot to mention. Basically, there's this fan thing that's going on in these, and earlier, actually, if I'm not going to go back to it, but in Abigail, there's a fan in it, and in a couple of the others, there's fans. So it's kind of like airing out, ventilation. There's something to that symbol for her. So I'm thinking about Black representation. I'm thinking about walking through the Met and looking at Rubens or at any other large paintings of that nature, which are about a decadence that was funded through procuring riches from other parts of the world in questionable ways. So it's really interesting stuff that's like not too far underneath the surface of these paintings. And again, this is just kind of palette cleansing the environment that she's in, but beautifully painted. Really, you know, they're small, they're modest in scale, these pieces. Now, this piece back here is gigantic. It's 72 by 156. So you're talking about 6 by 14, 15 feet. And again, letting these, you know, figures emerge out of the abstraction, beautifully painted. You know, look at the nuance of that line that she uses to describe those arms, and the subtlety that she uses very little to describe that face, but it's there. And okay. And now we're going to move on to a couple of these pieces. Packer started painting flowers from observation in 2012, originally as respite between portraits. During a visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she was inspired by French 19th century painter Henri Fontaine-Latour's still life, you know, flower still lives. His ability to imbue the object with emotion, Packard questioned, how can painting a bouquet feel more compelling than a painting of a person? How do I feel the humanness of a thing? Her flower paintings began to embody the fragility of life, just as her portraits embody a tenderness toward the lives she paints. Packard describes particular flower compositions as funerary bouquets, and vessels of personal grief made in response to tragedies of state and institutional violence against Black Americans. Say her name. References Sandra Bland, the Black woman who was found hanged in jail after being assaulted and arrested by police. So they're beautifully painted, they're beautifully handled. And if you didn't know what she was thinking about, you'd say, oh, it's a lovely painting. And it is a lovely painting, but it's got layers of meaning for her. Again, an exercise in tenderness. Now, you know, this really interesting, is it a man or a woman? The uniform, is it a policeman? What's going on here? What are we looking at in this figure on the right? Again, beautifully handled paint, the unfinished quality to it, that becoming that's in the paintings is really interesting. Let me see if there's any questions that have come up for any of you. No, not at this point. Okay. All right. A lesson in longing. Again, really interesting business in this, you know, kind of color field painting. It's a big piece. This is 108 by 137, which is really, it's enormous, which is something that the color field painters were really into, the scale of them. Now, you know, the sensitivity of the way the paint is applied, you know, and what is this veiled figure? You know, is this a Muslim interior? What's going on here? And again, the question marks about this painting, the enigma of what's going on here spatially, what's going on between these figures. Is it COVID that we're talking about and the isolation, or what's happening here?
Larry?
Yes.
I'm still here. There is a question.
Okay.
Somebody wanted to know, in the previous slide, is the one on the right a collage? No.
This is all paint. Basically, she's scraping and removing paint and things like that, scratching into it and all that. But no, these are all straight on paintings. You know, you can see how she kind of dug in and removed paint, using a rag, using a knife, and all that. So it's really scraped back. But interesting question. No, she doesn't do collage as far as I've been able to get from what I've seen. Okay. And again, with the fans.
Larry, before you go on that previous painting,
yes,
somebody asked if the jacket does look like a different material.
Oh, that.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually the scraping down of the canvas. So if you look at it, it's like the weave of the canvas is showing through. So she used a knife to scrape it off, and she uses a knife and a rag. So they give you different kinds of marks when you're painting. So she's using, you know, fairly heavy weave either linen or cotton duck as far as her canvases are concerned. This is 2017. She's using linen. Better quality stuff. Okay. So blessed are those who mourn. And again, we've got the fans in here, the clearing of the air, the sense of grief that we've all felt in the past year and a half, 2 years, over the events happening outside and the isolation that we've all had to endure. Again, huge painting, 118 by 172. Okay. And we are now about to move on to Beauford Delaney. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about before I move on is look at the eyes on these two figures. You know, there's a sense of loss, a sense of grief, a sense of pain in those eyes. And they, although they're 70 years apart when these two painters approach these figures, there's something there that's resonant. Very different approach, Beauford Delaney to Jennifer Packer's work. Very thick, a lot of impasto, built up, you know, really rich textures. He was I'm gonna move on to the next slide, which is an early work from 1946. He let's see, I'll do a little background thing on him. He was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. Actually studied painting there. He was born in 1901. Studied painting there. When he was in his early 20s, actually, let's go to 1919. In 1919, his father died, who was a reverend. So he had a fairly middle-class background. He had he was the 8th of 10 children in his family. And in 1919, his father died. I don't know when that was in relationship to the Knoxville riots, but there were massive riots that happened in Knoxville, where many Black people were murdered on the streets. There was a Black man who was accused of murdering a white woman, and that was the springboard into a massive amount of violence, and that really affected Beauford for many years after that, the trauma of that experience. So in the early 20s, he goes to study in Boston in 1923. So that would put him at 22 years old. And he's taking classes in Boston for a few years, and then decides that it's time for him to move to New York. He moves to New York in 1929, which is right in the middle of the Depression. And one of the things that happens is he does, like I said earlier, he does hook into the Whitney and gets a stipend to paint there, has a studio, has an apartment, works as a maintenance man, so he, you know, gets some food on the table. He's very active, though, in Harlem, and the the Harlem Renaissance is full bloom at that point. Although the Depression, of course, has affected them too, but the WPA is also happening at that time. So he, oh God, I can't remember if it was Palmer or that one of the black mural artists actually engaged him to help work on one of the mural projects that they were working on. Actually, let me see. Charles Alston. There it is. Charles Alston, who was one of the basically early pioneers of the Black Harlem Renaissance movement, and he was a muralist, and so basically Baldwin hooked up with him. Baldwin, Delaney. I'm getting ahead of myself because James Baldwin, who was born in 1923, I believe, was actually friends with Delaney, but that I'll talk more about. Delaney was friends with a very literary group like Miller. He knew O'Keeffe. He knew he was friends with Hirschfeld, the wonderful Broadway cartoonist, shall we say? So he knew, and traveled in a very literate crowd. So I'm gonna say, at this point, I'm showing you the Screen Street thing. He lived in Greenwich Village, but also worked in Harlem and was part of that group. And an important piece of the picture is he was gay. And at that time, he had to be a closeted gay man because basically it was unacceptable in the art crowd in Harlem to be gay. It was just not, one of the things that they wanted to put out there. They were really careful about their crafting of who they were and what they wanted to present to the world. And that was not one of them at that time. So his life down in Greenwich Village was really isolated from his life up in Harlem. And so, there was a gay crowd that he ran with down in the village, but it was still something you had to be really careful of, especially if you're a Black gay man. I mean, the idea of being lynched is not out of the question.
Larry?
Okay. Yes.
One of the viewers said that his work reminds her of Romare Bearden.
Yeah, Romare Bearden was somebody that he would have known and actually showed with, and also the other one is Jacob Lawrence, who was also one of those people. And there's another Black artist who I was really tempted to throw in here, but there's only so much I can do with one of these talks, is William Johnson, who was just fabulous artist. And they knew each other. In fact, they had a show together at one point. And maybe I'll show some of those at some point. But anyway, I'm going to move on. Here is a self-portrait from 1962. So at this point, Beauford would be 61 and living in Paris. But the reason I brought this out is basically he was, in 1940, he met James Baldwin. And Baldwin was a young man. He was, in his early 20s. And There they are. Okay. Baldwin on sat for him, nude. Delaney was a mentor to Baldwin. Delaney really knew, was involved with the beginnings of the NAACP, a number of the Black intelligentsia, Du Bois, a number of people that he knew and met in the Harlem crowd that he ran with, really helped formulate his political and racial awareness, and he really shared that with Baldwin, and he championed Baldwin at a very young age. Now they became lovers, along with being mentee, and that would be really a lifelong, powerful relationship between the two of them. Though they may not have lived together for the whole time, they were in relationship to each other. I'm going to slide back here. And I wanted to touch on the business of Alice Neal and Beauford Delaney. Were traveling in parallel courses at that point. And the linear element, the distortion, the expressiveness of their portraits is something that they share. This business of distortion, this kind of Van Gogh-like outlining of the figure, so it's got this really powerful, expressive quality to it. Okay. But one major difference between him and Alice Neal is these impostors. And although you may not be able to see it too clearly in here, I'll try and pop up my zoom in thing. But yeah, you can kind of see how thick the paint is, although this is a lousy, image that I've got for it. When and if you actually do get the Rosenfeld Gallery and see these paintings in person, you'll see how thick the paint gets. But you'll see this in other forms. Now, he painted well over a dozen portraits of James Baldwin over the years. The one on the left says that it was from 1945 to 1953. We're not exactly clear about when this painting was painted, but look at how thick the paint is in that background. It's like frosting on a cake. Really interesting, color harmonies and all that.
Oh, Larry, somebody,
yes.
Viewer said the portrait on the left has very light skin for James Baldwin.
Well, it really is about the painting more than it's about the color of his skin. So he did something which made it work in this situation. Okay. Delaney moved to Paris in 1953. He had established himself as a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance in the decades prior, gaining widespread recognition for pastel portraits of African-American figures such as W.E. Du Bois, Duke Ellington. He decided at age 52 to make the move. It was his first trip to Europe that Delaney originally planned to visit Rome, but became so enchanted with Paris that he decided to settle there. This was an interesting choice at a time when the center of the art world was clearly shifting to New York City. This choice largely had to do with the fact that, you know, he was trying to escape racism in America and homophobia. So he settled in a kind of bohemian area of Paris. And he and Baldwin relished this sense of freedom. And this is a photograph of them traveling down the avenue. Okay, two more portraits, one from 1944, one from 1967. You can see that there's you know, a long-term relationship between the two of them. Baldwin, I learned about light from Beauford Delaney. The light contained in everything, in surface, in every face. Okay. While Delaney had always been a keen observer of his environment, his move to Paris saw him progressively shift towards an impressionistic style that clearly distinguished him from his contemporaries. The city scenes Delaney created while living in New York in the 40s pulsate with bright, vibrant color. The picture plane is clearly delineated in contained forms and figures. Even though his work had already become progressively non-representational in a manner associated, he played off the abstract expressionists and took it in his own direction. But he would play back and forth between figuration and abstraction. Okay, and here's a portrait of his mother. And this is from 1964. You know, it's hard to see in this reproduction how thick the paint is in the background, but there's, again, it's very much, you know, the abstract quality of the mark making in that background is something that's important to him, building up this very thick, heavy paint. I think this painting was painted from a photograph. I'm not really sure. He did go back to Knoxville and visit his mother at various points, but I'm not sure, you know, whether this was there or not. Okay. Delaney and Baldwin frequented the small jazz clubs of Paris. They were both big fans of jazz and music in general. Beauford did a series of portraits of jazz notables, including Duke Ellington, Charlie Yardbird Parker, throughout his career. The rhythmic strokes and buoyant color parallel his exuberant love of the music in this piece. And you can see the play back and forth between the abstraction and the representational, you know, and he didn't draw a line between them. It was really about what he wanted to express. A real, you know, really a free spirit. He didn't hold himself to a particular style, which gives gallerists a real problem because they like to have one voice come out of an artist. But hey, you know what? He's an explorer. Okay. Painted in 1968, Delaney's Street Scene Paris is an important example of the artist's later work. Swirls of yellow paint move across the surface of the canvas, build a heavily impastoed scene of a vibrant cityscape, as if seen through a haze of blinding sunlight. Blurred boundaries of abstraction figuration in manner evocative of Monet and Van Gogh. This work harkens back to Delaney's street scenes of the 1940s and exemplifies his painterly investigation of color and light. And again, you know, these pieces, you know, they're not that far from each other, these sun-drenched things. And again, I wanted to place him in context. Dubuffet, very influenced by, you know, paintings of what they call outsider artists, the art of the insane, self-taught folk artists. Dubuffet used that as his model and would use these really thick impastos. And I wanted to, you know, just draw a little bit of a parallel. Of course, Beauford would have been aware of Dubuffet, and that kind of almost sculptural use of paint. This is an interesting piece. Now, this was painted in 1968. It may have been painted from, it was definitely painted from a photograph, but it may have been painted before or after Robert Kennedy's assassination. Actually, Beauford would have been very aware of Robert Kennedy because James Baldwin in I believe it was 63, had a really adamant confrontational conversation with Robert Kennedy about civil rights and about the plight of Blacks in America. And he actually turned Robert Kennedy's thinking. In fact, Baldwin was credited for having put in Robert Kennedy's mind the need for change, and he brought that to his brother, and really that was a major piece of the shift in legislation. So Beauford would have had a very strong attachment to Kennedy. Okay. The name of the show is Be Your Wonderful Self, Portraits of Beauford Delaney. So you won't see a lot of the landscapes and things like that. I threw those in just to give some idea of that end of his work. Most of the work that is in the show at Rosenfeld are the portraits and some of the abstractions alongside each other. So Beauford Delaney painted this self-portrait in 1970 while visiting Baldwin's villa at Saint-Paul-de-Vence, a medieval town in the south of France. Delaney was thought to have been in psychological crisis at that time. So toward the end of his life, he was really helped out a lot by James Baldwin. He was in and out of institutions. You can see from this self-portrait that he's a rather troubled man. The work that I have seen of his, now I haven't seen the show at Rosenfeld, but the work that I have seen of his is just fabulous. He's just a wonderful painter. Little known, little credited at this time, though he was very well known at the time. He did have a retrospective at the Studio Museum in Harlem in I believe it was 1970. When was it? 1978? Yeah, I believe it was 1978. And he also had a major retrospective at the Knoxville Museum of Art. They have a large holding of his work. And then let's see, that down here is a YouTube that you can find on, basically on YouTube. It's if you don't know about him, there's this guy who rides around on a bike and does reviews of shows, and he did a really wonderful job on this one. So it's worth looking up this YouTube. And Jennifer Packer, this show is opening October 30th and on through April of 2022. There is an upcoming lecture on November 6th, and you can sign on to that through the Whitney website. Let's see if there's any questions here.
No, just compliments, Larry.
Okay, all right. So great. That's it for this one. We're gonna, I believe the next talk I'm gonna do is on the Surrealist show at the Metropolitan. That'll be in 2 weeks. And so thank you all for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Larry. And thank you all for coming. All right, bye-bye.
All right, bye.